Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day 10 of the Bible in 365. My name's Brad Reeves. I'm your host, and I'm happy to be here with you this evening. Today we will be exploring Genesis chapter 30 to Genesis chapter 31, verse 42. Let's get started. In a brief recap of yesterday's lesson, God gave Leah children and made Rachel childless to entice Jacob to love and care for Leah. Now, picking up where that story left off, Rachel was jealous, and she says to Jacob, "Give me children or I will die." Now, Rachel can't conceive, just like Sarah, so Rachel pulls a Sarah and offers up her maidservant for her husband to sleep with. Now, maidservants were essentially the form of surrogacy in that day and age. Now, Jacob sleeps with Bilhah and conceives and bears a son. Rachel feels vindicated, and so she calls this son Dan. Now, Bilhah conceives again and bears yet another son, and this son is named Naphtali. At this point in time, Leah gets jealous, and she realizes that she herself has stopped conceiving, so she offers up her maidservant to Jacob, Zilpah. Now, Zilpah conceives a son, and they call this son Gad, and then she conceives again and calls that son Asher. Now, at this point in time, the story has a little bit of a break, and it says that Reuben, the eldest, went out and got some mandrakes. This was Leah's son. So Rachel traded her night with Jacob for some mandrakes because Leah would not just give them to her. So she said, "Fine, you can sleep with Jacob tonight." So Leah slept with Jacob and conceived. And she bore him a fifth son, and she named this son Issachar. And then she had yet another and named him Zebulun. And then she also gave birth to a daughter, Dinah. Now, it was at this point in time that the Lord remembered Rachel and granted Rachel a son. Rachel named him Joseph. Moving on to Genesis 25 through 43. At this point in time, Jacob knows that it's finally time to go back home to his land of Canaan, but Jacob's uncle Laban asked him to stay because God's blessing on Jacob had overflowed into his own life. We see this in our own lives. When God blesses us, the people around us are part of the overflow of that blessing. They benefit because of God's blessing on our lives. And this is what was happening. God had blessed Jacob, and so Laban naturally was blessed from just being around him. Now, Jacob makes negotiations with Laban so that he can start growing his own flock of sheep and goats. He said that he would separate the speckled and the spotted animals to stack the odds against him, and he would create his own flock. Now, Jacob used a selective breeding process, and he became really, really prosperous. At this point in time, we move forward to chapter 31, and it tells us that Jacob is now a really wealthy guy, and this makes his cousins jealous. So they start rumors about him and start talking in a hostile manner towards him and about him. All this negative talk makes it back to Laban, and he starts believing all of it as well. And so his attitude or his temperament towards Jacob begins to change in a negative way. So God tells Jacob it is time to return to the land of promise, to the land of his fathers. Now it's at this point, after the Lord reveals this, that Jacob goes and recounts all that has happened to his wives, Leah and Rachel. He tells them of the deceit of Laban and of the blessing and provision that God has had in the midst of that deceit. Now, Jacob also recounts to them his dream that he had, wherein God reminds him of this vision and reminds him that he is the God that had appeared to him at Bethel, where he set up a pillar and anointed it. At this point in time, Rachel and Leah said that their father has nothing left to offer them, so Jacob is free to do what God has told him to do. And so Jacob gathers up all he has and he flees without telling Laban. And at this point, it is an important note that as they're fleeing, Rachel decides to steal the household gods of her father, Laban. Now they're about 3 days into their journey, and Laban was informed that Jacob had fled. Jacob had not told Laban that he was going to leave. He was scared that Laban would not give him permission to take his daughters, Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, with him. So he just leaves. So Laban was informed that Jacob had fled, and Laban gathers some of his men and pursues Jacob for about a week. And he catches up with Jacob in Gilead. There, the Lord appears to Laban in a dream and tells him to say nothing good or bad to Jacob about the events that have occurred. We then see that Laban meets up with Jacob and has a man-to-man conversation and asks him why. He says, "Why didn't you tell me that you were going to leave? You left without telling me, and someone also stole my gods." Now, at this point, Jacob is furious, and he said, "No one in my house should have stolen anything. Whoever stole these goods, these gods, these household gods of yours, they shall not live." And he says this without knowing that Rachel had stole them. So Laban searches all the tents, and he finds nothing. He finally comes to Rachel's tent, and she was hiding them inside of her camel's saddlebag. She's sitting on top of it to discreetly hide them. And when her father comes into the tent, she says, "Hey, I can't get up to greet you because I'm on my period," when the actuality is she's just trying to hide the gods that she stole. So ultimately, Laban finds nothing. At this point, Jacob gets angry at the accusation, and he gives a defense of everything that he has done for Laban and all of the ways that Laban has wronged him and treated him unfairly. He says, that Jacob, when he was working for Laban, had to pay for sheep and possessions that were stolen from people he didn't even know. How he worked 14 years for his wives and 6 years for the flocks, and how his wages were changed 10 different times. Laban couldn't make up his mind. He was always out to only benefit himself, not to benefit Jacob. He was not a man of his word or a man of his promise. In fact, Jacob gets so mad with him and he calls him out and he says, "Laban, you came here today to rob me of everything I have and to leave me empty-handed. In fact, if it wasn't for the God of Abraham and the God of my father Isaac, then you would have robbed me. In fact, it's just the fact that God appeared to you and the fact that you're scared of God and the fact that you are also scared of my father Isaac that you haven't robbed me." So it is here, after Jacob calls him out, that we end our reading for tonight. I don't know about you, but I am curious to find out what happens, how Laban reacts to this, and what is going to go down. If you'd like to find out, continue reading and join us tomorrow as we take a look at Genesis chapter 31, starting in verse 43 and reading until Genesis chapter 34, ending in verse 31. All right, folks, that's all I have for you tonight. God bless.